citizens, what a pleasure it is to have the opportunity to gather with you today. My name is Thomas Jefferson, and I welcome this opportunity to gather with you on this special day that I hear is called President's Day, and a family festival at that, to continue to remind ourselves and pass through our families the importance of recognizing our nation's civil servants. And I mean that nonetheless in the office of the president, because I never forgot, as I served for 8 years, 2 terms, that I was a public servant, a servant of the people, as all our government are wont to honor our nation in that service. We're gathered here at my retreat house. This is nonetheless a president's house. Oh yes, I think you know that I live at Monticello. That's my little mountain, Monticello in Italian, little mountain. It's about 75 miles north from here, and that is near where I was born and grew up on a farm known as Shadwell. When I was 25 years old in 1768, then I decided I would like to spend the rest of my life upon that little mountain near where I was born. And so I leveled the top of it off, and I built a little cottage, and a few years later I brought my bride, and that's where we began our family. As a retreat house, if you will, this has followed specifically my design of an octagon. I so appreciate the octagonal shape, 8 sides. And what makes my retreat house, Poplar Forest, so unique is there is a window in each of those 8 sides that frames a scene of nature in the distance. So I find it a pleasurable place, not only to be here by myself, but also with my family, and also to invite my immediate neighbors to come and visit and share a meal. But this hospitality is something that I made an effort to practice when I was president of our nation and had the privilege to live in the president's house. And I thought we would spend our time here, certainly no more than 30 minutes, if that, so that I might reflect upon my experiences in the president's house. That might be useful, particularly as I understand that there will ensue in time a White House Historical Society. So if you will, in honor of the beginning of the White House Historical Society, in honor of the future First Lady, I believe they tell me her name is Jacqueline Kennedy, I should like to reflect upon my experience in the President's house. Well, firstly, I can tell you that experience began with the contest that President George Washington held for the design of the President's house. Now, our government was in Philadelphia during this time. We were there during the 1790s for the most part, the purpose being that it would allow our government a place to conduct government while we would formally build a federal city, the national capital, if you will. We had already decided that it will be along the banks of the Potomac in honor of our first president, that it would be named Washington in the District of Columbia, a 10-mile square district devoted to that national capital. And so President Washington had the honor to be the judge of those who would be interested to submit designs for the president's house. The Villa Rotunda that I sought as a prototype for the president's house had 4 sides of columned porticos. And then, of course, as rotunda would suggest, in the center was a magnificent rotunda or dome. This was very much an imitation, if you will, of the Pantheon in Rome, though I had never been to Rome either to see that magnificent building. However, you may know that the Pantheon in Rome, from the drawings that I have seen of it, has served as the prototype for the library at my University of Virginia, which many will simply refer to as the Rotunda. And so that first design for the president's house was submitted under an alias initially. and I lost. Rather, the design of a most accomplished Irish architect by the name of James Hoban was the winner. And I will admit it is a very simple and classical design. I think that President Washington might have favored it because he knew that Mr. Hoban had designed the Charleston Courthouse in Charleston, South Carolina. Now, I wish I could tell you I have seen it with my own eyes. I have not. I've seen renderings of it, but President Washington certainly saw it. Oh, he traveled throughout all of the states of our nation, and visiting South Carolina and visiting there in Charleston, he was quite taken with the design of the courthouse in Charleston, Mr. Hoban's design. So if you know of the courthouse in Charleston and put it next to the design of the President's house that was chosen by President Washington, the design of Mr. Hoban, you will see quite the similarities. Now, the design for the President's house by Mr. Hoban is a bit larger. It is 2 facades, that is 2 stories, though initially he designed 3. And it is 11 bays, that is 11 window sections, though he originally designed 9 bays. So you can well understand that Mr. Hoban's original design was somewhat taller, perhaps a bit more austere than the final design that was agreed upon. And that, I think, the final design of 11 bays and 2 stories is much more comfortable, if you will, in its simplicity. So that is the building that was begun when President Washington and myself and several others, including the architect James Hoban, gathered on the site in Washington City on October 13th, 1792, for the purpose of laying the cornerstone. As I said earlier, I appreciated Mr. Hoban's design, its simplicity, its nobility, if you will, of architecture. However, I suggested that it might need something to make it the more noble from the south vantage point, that is, looking at it from the south lawn. It had a very delicate bay, but I thought the bay would be even the more delicate and the more ennobled were it to have columns erected, 2 stories high. And then on the opposite side, on the north side, which was then to be considered the formal entrance, because truly, while Mr. Adams lived there, and as I began to live there, you would enter from the south. You'd come up the south lawn, and then you'd ascend, if you will, a staircase that went to the first story. Because remember, the ground floor was that floor that was held for particular activities and mundane daily attentions to living, and all of the various cellars that were there attended. But the formal floor, the formal chambers, were on the first floor, and you entered that above. And so I decided that we would turn the formal entrance to the opposite side of the President's house, on the north side. And to make it more agreeable, let alone the more ennobled, that we should construct a porte-cochere. Now, a porte-cochere, if you will, is simply a columned porch. That is, a porch built out over the entrance that shields anyone coming in or out of the President's house from the elements, from rainstorms or snowstorms, any inclemency, that you would be able then to drive your carriage through that porte-cochere and alight from your carriage to go in the President's house, let alone to come from within the President's house to enter in your carriage. So these 2 suggestions for the improvement of the President's house I worked on with an architect by the name of Benjamin Henry Latrobe, and they would not be completed until sometime after I left the President's house. I also suggested the completion of what Mr. Hoban actually had in mind, and that was terraced walkways to be built out from the east and the west sides, the east and west ends of the President's house, not dissimilar from the terraced walkway you see built out to your right, built out to the east side of Poplar Forest here. And so I desired that to be more or less not only a terraced walkway, but a colonnaded walkway that you could walk inside it along pavers, if you will, flat stones amidst the columns. And now I am told in time that there will be a west wing attached to that west colonnaded walkway, and that there will be an east wing as well attached. So the inception, the idea of those columned walkways, those terraced walkways, was not only Mr. Hobbins, but I myself endeavored to formalize it. Now, furthermore, I will tell you, it was somewhat indecent to think that the president or anyone coming to visit, let alone his family, might have to solely subsist with chamber pots, and I think you may understand what I am meaning by that, or to go out of doors to the necessary when nature would call. And of course, Mr. Adams had to attend to that as well, those who visited him. I decided that we should demolish the 2 outdoor privies and build indoor privies, very much as I have built right here in Poplar Forest, as I have built in Monticello, and I suggested to my neighbor and friend, Governor James Barber of Barbersville, just north of me from Charlottesville, the very same in the design of his house, which, Barbersville Mansion House, includes an octagonal hall right in the center. So I think the improvement by adding indoor privies is one of natural necessity for continuing to engage in your socials and in your works and administration indoors. Now, furthermore, I Rumfordized the fireplaces. Now, you may look quizzically, what do you mean Rumfordize? R-U-M-F-O-R-D. Mr. Rumford, who had invented a much more efficient method of designing a fireplace. The original fireplaces of the president's house were the old design, which meant simply that the fireplace was built deep into the wall and had somewhat of a cumbersome flue. Cumbersome because there was a shelf just at the bottom of the chimney before then you would come into the fireplace itself, so that the fire being made and set, the smoke would come up over that shelf to go up the chimney. And as I said, the fireplace being built deep into the wall was so narrow that the heat would only flow out in a singular direction. Mr. Rumford, a man of great scientific curiosity, created an alleviating of that cumbrance of a flue and the narrow fireplace itself. He created more or less a depth in the back of the fireplace that went straight up. It was more narrow as you approached the back of the fireplace, and the flames and the smoke would go straight up. There was no shelf to encumber it, to prohibit the smoke from flying up the flue and through the chimney piece. And then furthermore, the outward design of the fireplace was more open. It was wider so that there would be a greater radiation of heat throughout the particular room. So I remain quite proud of that innovation in the president's house. I will tell you as well, I decided, rather than to have to call out for anyone to come serve or to attend to the gatherings or the meal tables or for families, that I would create a system of bells and pulleys so that I could be in my office or elsewhere in the president's house and not have to go out and shout through the house, but rather pull a cord and the bell would ring in another room and thereby suggest attentions were immediately necessary. So I have already created the same at Monticello, and I find that this was quite useful in the president's house for those entire 8 years. Now, when I speak of social gatherings, I'm happy to say that I found it of necessity to build a wine cellar. Oh, yes. Unfortunately, not within the president's house itself. No, I decided to build the wine cellar outside of the president's house and to call it simply the Ice House. But that is where I would stock many of the foreign wines that I consider so useful and delicate at the meal table in order to lift the spirits and make for a greater sense of camaraderie and socializing. I became quite the devotee of fine wines when I had the privilege to serve our nation for 5 delightful years in La Belle, France, to travel through Burgundy, to travel about Bourgogne, to sample these elegant wines, and to realize that they do improve the tastes of man, that they become a necessity of life for me. Who can deny their panacea for ailments and conducive to good conversation? And so I found it a necessity, as I certainly procured wines for President Washington and President Adams, that even more so let us have well-stocked wine cellars right on the spot. And so I designed in kind. I created a landscape design, that is a landscaping design for the gardens of the president's house. I also began an experimental garden in the president's house. That's right. So many who would send seeds from around the world who would like to share with us the bounty of what they had in foreign lands, to think that it might be useful to us, and vice versa. I then would plant these seeds and plant the vegetables and curiosities from around the globe right there in a garden at the president's house. I understand that that has been continued through successive administrations, particularly within the last 10 years or so. So these were amenities that I hope have proven useful throughout the years, and I hope have been further improved upon by successors to that office. Now, when I speak of gatherings, I cannot deny that when you speak of all of the different opinions in politics, that the president's house, particularly those gathered around the meal table, may have an opportunity to assuage some of those differences of opinion, to come together and enjoy conversations on many subjects other than politics, conversations upon art, conversations upon travel, conversations upon science, or the curiosities, if you will, of the expedition led by Captain Meriwether Lewis and Lieutenant Clark. You know, when they sent me back those curiosities that they had found in the wilderness far out west, the noble antlers, if you will, of wapitas and bison and moose, well, I immediately had them hanged in the president's house. Yes, at the entrance hall, so that many who would come into the president's house would experience very much the same when they enter my Indian hall at Monticello. And see all of the native relics, if you will, particularly the moose antlers and the wapiti antlers and the mountain goats and the like, that this would engage people in conversation and open their minds more to the wonders of nature. And as we gathered around the meal table, again, what better way to assuage differences of political opinion than to have intimate gatherings? I rarely would dine with less than about 10 or 12 people and have them seated, if you will, at a round table. I would not encourage to dine with many more than that, because I think the intimacy of your dining around a round table, why a round table? There's no head at a round table, is much more conducive to the intimacy of conversation and shared experiences. And then, to make the meal far more engaging, French cuisine. Oh, I have become quite the devotee of French cuisine ever since I've returned from those 5 years in France. I mean, not to abjure my native victuals, no, but rather to have them prepared in the French fashion, with sauces and the kind. And so we brought back many recipes with us that were used in the president's house and were applied by our chef, Honor Julien. Oh, the esteemed French chef that served and prepared at the president's house, Monsieur Julien. And the maitre d'hotel, oh my heavens, yes, Etienne Lemaire, Monsieur Lemaire. A maitre d', of course, is he who presides over all of the arrangements of social gatherings, he who presides over the proper setting of the meal table and who should sit with whom. And so we benefited, if you will, from those two esteemed Frenchmen who lived in the president's house and improved our taste and the taste of our countrymen. I would say, too, that as we dined with family, and I mentioned my family earlier, Mrs. Randolph, my daughter, Martha, and my daughter, Mrs. Epps, Mariah. They lived there at the president's house for a time, though lamentably, when she was only 24 years old, my dear daughter, Mariah Epps, passed away. As you know, I was only married for 10 years. And I promised Mrs. Jefferson, the late Mrs. Jefferson, I would never marry again. And so while I was president, my surviving daughter, Mrs. Randolph, Martha, served more or less as a hostess in the president's house, as did Mrs. Madison, Dolly Madison. Remember, Mr. James Madison was Secretary of State in my two administrations, so he was a frequent visitor to the president's house. But beside my family that would gather around, beside the many congressmen who would gather there, oh heavens, I'll never forget some of them. Samuel Taggart, oh my, what a Federalist in his opinions. William Plummer, oh, in fact, I understand that William Plummer and Mr. Taggart have left quite the descriptions of the gatherings, the social functions in Mr. Jefferson's administrations. And so has a news writer, a lovely lady, Margaret Bayard Smith. I knew her husband, Samuel Harrison Smith, and Mrs. Smith in Philadelphia. They owned a newspaper. And so when our government moved to Washington, I invited them to come down to Washington in order to publish their newspapers. And they did. And Mrs. Smith gathered at the president's house frequently, and from what I understand, has written quite the extensive descriptions of the meals and the social gatherings that were held there. And then, of course, how could I possibly neglect it? It must not be neglected. Those who labored for our happiness. I'm referring, of course, to the servants in the president's house. Yes, I've already mentioned Monsieur le Maire, Monsieur Julien. My coachman, who served me for 8 years there, was an Irishman, Joseph Doherty. But then, of course, there were the enslaved who accompanied me from Monticello to serve in the president's house. Peter Fawcett came up to serve honorably and diligently there. And as well, the young Hughes woman who came up to serve. Miss Granger was her name. And do you know that as she married Wormley Hughes, the gardener at Monticello, she gave birth to a child in the president's house. That's right, Ursula Granger Hughes. The first child born in the president's house was her boy. Her boy. To be enslaved. He did not live very long. He passed away after several months. I can tell you that there was further joy for a birth in the president's house. My daughter aforementioned, Mrs. Randolph, Martha Jefferson Randolph, gave birth to James Madison Randolph in the president's house. My grandson, James Madison Randolph, named for our Secretary of State and my good friend, Jimmy Madison. So there could be much joy and there could be much sorrow in the president's house. And of the many other visitors who came, who can forget Captain Meriwether Lewis, who visited and regaled us with what he had discovered out west, Lieutenant William Clark as well, the man of great scientific curiosity, Robert Fulton, and no less the designer of bridges. Yes, he did. He designed bridges. He came to visit and extolled us with his stories of steam and its utilization for movement and empowerment. Mr. Alexander von Humboldt, Herr von Humboldt of Austria, came to visit to talk about his journeys, if you will, through South America, into the great jungles and forests and down the waterways, of what he could discover there and the information that he could bring back for all of us. John Quincy Adams and his lovely wife, Louisa, were frequent guests. I had known John Quincy Adams when he was a little boy and lived with his parents, his sister Nabby, his brother Charles, in Paris while I was serving there as our nation's minister plenipotentiary. John Quincy Adams and his wife came to meals many, many times. Oh, and I am certain he will relate when the, what would you refer to him? The emissary. He was not a bey, B-E-Y, but he was more or less an ambassador of the Kingdom of Tunis. Sidi Meli Meli. Yes, that was his name, Meli Meli. M-E-L-L-I Melli, Melli Melli. Yes, from Tunis, from the Barbary coasts of northern Africa, if you will, one who extolled the preachings of Muhammad, arrived in our country, in our federal city. It was 1805. He was there, sent by the Bey of his kingdom to negotiate with us because of the capture of several Tunisian warships. I would not, and I never have been, an advocate of paying the del gold, that is, tribute money, for an enemy to go away. No. We must have fair and free trade upon the high seas. Well, Melli Melli was there in all of his fanciful raiments, and they certainly were magnificent raiments, embroidered in rich colors, and his pantaloon pants that he would wear, let alone his great and long black beard. Can you imagine the effect he had in Washington society? Melli Melli traveled all throughout our nation. He went to Baltimore, he went to Philadelphia, he went to New York. No matter where he traveled, there were always quite a number who gathered around him. And he traveled as well with 11 of his own countrymen. They had come here with him as his retinue. So when I think back of all of those who came to visit at the President's house, and all of those who will continue through the future to reminisce and write down those years, those 2 administrations that I was privileged to hold, 8 years, I was the one to succeed President Washington for 2 terms. And though it is said I might have been elected for a third, I stood on the precedent set by President Washington. He could have been president for life, let alone to serve a third term. He turned it down upon principle, founding principles of our nation. And I followed in kind, the first to have that opportunity to secure that precedence. As you know, lamentably, Mr. Adams did not have a second term in the President's house. And so thereby, I took my leave when I turned the gavel over to Mr. Madison. It was March the 4th, 1809. I spent upwards of 3 days on the road from Washington City, following all of the wagons and the crates in which I had crated my books and furniture and works of art and sculpture, to return to Monticello. And it is said by the time that entire wagon train reached Culpeper that I suggested the train continue on to Monticello, that I would remain in the area of Culpeper alone, and that many people did not know what I did then for the next 3 days before I returned finally to my little mountain. And I think you may better understand I sought seclusion. I sought an opportunity to simply get away and be with myself and to reflect upon 40 years in public service, which continues the same object as I come to visit here at Poplar Forest. We certainly hope you will come to visit Poplar Forest as well. It is unique amongst the presidential houses. I understand many other presidents have had their retreats, but this perhaps is a prototype, simply to get away and enjoy the fine things in life. It has been a pleasure to be in your company here this day. I look forward to meeting with you. I look forward always to your questions and curiosities. But make certain on this President's Day, this family festival for all of us, that I ever remain your humble and obedient servant, Thomas Jefferson. Godspeed.